Aristocracy, Elara Vance had decided, was nothing more than well-dressed bankruptcy. She stood near a pillar draped in suffocating velvet, the oppressive heat of the Marchioness of Danbury's ballroom pressing down on her. The air was a thick concoction of expensive French perfume, wilting flowers, and the faint, cloying scent of desperation. It was the 8th season since her family's fortunes had exploded, catapulting them from comfortable obscurity into the viper's nest of the ton, and she still felt like a poorly forged coin passed under a discerning eye. Her gown, a shimmering creation of silver silk that had cost more than the yearly wages of a dozen of her father's dockworkers, felt like a costume. It was armor, meant to deflect the thinly veiled sneers and condescending smiles, but tonight it felt too thin. Her disadvantage was not merely her birth, a fact whispered behind fluttering fans and gloved hands, but the fresh, still bleeding wound of a broken engagement. Lord Caspian Finch, the man who had sworn his undying love while simultaneously assessing her dowry, was across the room. He stood beside his new fiancée, Lady Beatrice Croft, a woman whose pedigree was as flawless as her porcelain skin. Elara watched them, a cold, hard knot tightening in her stomach. Nausea was a deeply unromantic feeling, and it was the only thing Caspian had ever truly inspired in her. He laughed, a bright, empty sound, and Beatrice tapped his arm with her fan, her movements a study in vapid perfection. They were a matched set, beautiful and useless as porcelain shepherds. The sting was not the loss of Caspian, who she had quickly realized was a man of weak character and even weaker finances, but the public humiliation. He had discarded her for a woman with a better name, making it brutally clear that her father's money, while desirable, could not wash away the grime of its origins. Her gaze drifted from the happy couple, scanning the periphery of the room where the other outcasts lingered. The spinsters, the widows, the gentlemen with more debts than prospects. And him. In a shadowed alcove, standing alone as he always did, was the Duke of Blackwood. Alastair Beaumont was a fortress unto himself. For 8 seasons, the same 8 seasons Elara had endured her London purgatory, he had attended these functions with the grim reluctance of a man condemned. He never danced. He rarely spoke. He simply stood, a tall, imposing figure carved from granite and disapproval, his presence sucking the warmth and frivolity from his immediate vicinity. The air around him was a vacuum. People gave his alcove a wide berth, as if his cold displeasure were a contagion. He was the quiet duke, a man of immense power and title, yet a ghost at every feast. Tonight, his expression was particularly thunderous. His dark hair was unadorned, his evening clothes severe and black, a stark contrast to the peacocks preening around him. He held a glass of what was likely brandy, his knuckles white as he stared into its amber depths as if searching for an answer to a question no one else had dared to ask. Elara found him fascinating. He was the ultimate aristocrat, a being of pure, unadulterated lineage, yet he seemed to loathe the very society he sat atop. A sudden, cruel titter of laughter broke her observation. Lady Beatrice, with Caspian trailing like a well-trained hound, was approaching a small group near Elara's pillar. "Oh, it's simply tragic," Beatrice said, her voice carrying with the precision of a well-aimed dart. "To have all that money and still be so unmarketable. One's breeding will always show, will it not?" The barb was meant for her. Elara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of anger, not shame. She kept her back straight, her chin level. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She was not some delicate flower wilting in the sun. She was the daughter of a man who had built a shipping empire from nothing, a man who battled storms and pirates and cutthroat merchants. She was made of sterner stuff. Caspian had the grace to look uncomfortable. He glanced at Elara, a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, in his weak eyes before he looked away. Pathetic. Indeed, chimed in Mr. Sterling, a sycophant of the highest order, his face a mask of oily agreement. Some stock simply isn't worth the investment, no matter how attractively packaged. The financial metaphor, so close to the truth of her own failed engagement, was a deliberate twist of the knife. The small group chuckled. The sound was sharp as shattered glass. Elara's carefully constructed composure began to fracture. It was one thing to be jilted, another to be mocked for it by the very people who defined her world. Her gaze flickered, uncontrollably, toward the shadowed alcove. The Duke of Blackwood was looking directly at them. At her. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were like chips of ice. There was no warmth in them, no sympathy. Only a cool, dismissive assessment. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. In that moment, she saw what he saw, a merchant's daughter, gauche and glittering with new money, the center of a tawdry little drama. An insect pinned to a board. Then, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the surrounding chatter like a blade. It was a low, resonant baritone, laced with a weariness that bordered on contempt. He addressed not the gossiping clique, but the men standing beside him, a portly baron who had evidently tried to engage him in conversation. "It seems the marketplace has spilled into the ballroom," the Duke murmured, his lip curling just so. "One can smell the desperation from here. The stench of trade." He did not look at her as he said it, but the insult was as direct as a slap. It was not just for Beatrice and her cronies. It was for her. The stench of trade. The very source of her fortune, the foundation of her father's life's work, dismissed as a foul odor polluting his aristocratic air. He lumped her in with the rest of them, a piece of merchandise in a vulgar spectacle. The Baron chuckled nervously. Beatrice's group fell silent, momentarily stunned by the Duke's unexpected utterance. The insult, coming from a man of his stature, carried an absolute finality. It was a judgment. Something inside Elara snapped. The humiliation, the anger, the years of feeling like an outsider, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, diamond-hard clarity. She was done. Done with the pity, done with the scorn, and done with being a passive victim in their cruel games. She did not burst into tears. She did not flee the room. Instead, a slow, icy calm washed over her. Her mind, always pragmatic, always strategic, began to work. She saw the board. She saw the pieces. And for the first time, she saw a path to victory. With a composure that felt utterly alien and yet completely her own, she pushed herself away from the pillar. She turned not toward her tormentors, but toward the Duke of Blackwood. She walked the 10 paces to his shadowed alcove, each step deliberate, her silver gown whispering over the polished floor. The small sea of onlookers parted before her, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. She stopped directly in front of him. He was even taller up close, a sheer cliff face of a man. The scent of bergamot and cold winter air clung to him, a stark contrast to the ballroom's cloying perfume. He lifted his gaze from his glass, his pale eyes narrowing with irritation at her audacity. Elara did not speak. She held his gaze, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of 100 pairs of eyes press down upon them. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that mocked the fluttering gestures of women like Beatrice, she sank into the deepest, most formal curtsy she could manage. It was an act of exaggerated, sarcastic deference. A bow before a king, laden with the very thing he despised, theatricality. She held the pose for a long, pointed moment, her head bowed, the silver silk of her dress pooling around her feet like liquid moonlight. She could feel his stare burning the top of her head. When she finally rose, her expression was a placid mask, but her eyes held a glint of pure, unadulterated steel. Without a word, she turned and walked away. Not back to her pillar of shame, but toward the grand staircase and the exit. Her exit was not a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. And Elara Vance had just chosen her weapon. It was the Duke of Blackwood himself. He just did not know it yet. The chill of the night air was a welcome shock as Elara stepped out of the carriage, the sound of its wheels receding on the cobblestones leaving an unnerving silence. Her father's house, a grand and somewhat ostentatious testament to his success in Cheapside, was dark save for a single light in the study. She knew he would be there, hunched over his ledgers, the familiar scent of ink and old paper his constant companions. She did not go to him. Not yet. She swept past the concerned butler and went straight to her own chambers, the silver gown suddenly feeling like a lead weight. She stripped it off, letting it fall into a heap on the floor, a shimmering, discarded skin. In her simple cotton chemise, she felt more herself. She walked to the window and stared out at the sleeping city, the distant masts of ships in the port just visible against the bruised pre-dawn sky. The stench of trade. The Duke's words echoed in her mind, not as an insult, but as a key. He despised commerce. He despised the grubby reality of money. And in that contempt, Elara sensed a vulnerability. Men like the Duke of Blackwood believed their power was an immutable fact of nature, a right bestowed by God and blood. They never imagined it could be as fragile as a line of credit. For the next 2 days, Ilara did not wallow. She marshaled her forces. Her father, a man who trusted numbers more than he trusted people, had insisted on her education. While other young ladies learned watercolors and the pianoforte, Ilara had learned accounting. She understood balance sheets, assets, and the crippling power of debt. She sent quiet inquiries through her father's network of bankers and solicitors, men who operated in a world of whispered truths and hard figures, a world utterly alien to the ton. The information, when it came, was better than she could have hoped for. It was delivered in a plain brown envelope by a clerk who refused to meet her eye. Inside, a single sheet of paper detailed the quiet, catastrophic decay of the Blackwood estate. The Duke, it turned out, was drowning. Generations of profligate ancestors, coupled with a series of disastrous agricultural investments made by his late father, had hollowed out the ducal fortune. The Blackwood title was a magnificent, gilded house built on a foundation of sand. He was land-rich and cash-destitute, clinging to his legacy while the floor crumbled beneath his feet. His creditors were circling, held at bay only by the power of his name, a power that was rapidly diminishing. Ilara read the report twice, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. It was a ledger of his ruin, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever read. His pride, his aloofness, his contempt, it was not just the arrogance of his station. It was the desperate posturing of a man on the edge of an abyss. He was a king presiding over a bankrupt kingdom. Her plan formed with the cold, irrefutable logic of a mathematical proof. He needed money. She had money. He had a title, a name that would grant her absolute security and silence the whispers of her origins forever. It was a simple, brutal transaction. A merger. She would not ask for his love, his affection, or even his respect. She would demand a contract. She spent the afternoon with her own solicitor, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Davies, drafting the terms. It was less a marriage settlement and more a corporate acquisition. Her dowry, a staggering sum that would make her father gasp, would be transferred to the Duke's name upon their marriage. It would be used exclusively to settle the Blackwood debts and restore the estate. In return, she would be the Duchess of Blackwood. She would have full, unimpeachable control over the household finances and estate management. Her name, Ilara Vance, would be etched beside his on every legal document. She would be his partner in business, if not in life. A final clause, added at her insistence, stipulated that upon his death, the estate and its assets would be managed by a trust she would oversee, ensuring its continued solvency. It was a clause that stripped his heirs of the ability to repeat the mistakes of their forefathers. It was her legacy, bought and paid for. Armed with the document, she prepared for her confrontation. She dressed not in glittering silk, but in a severe, dark blue traveling dress of heavy wool. It was the attire of a woman of business. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, tight chignon. No softness. No vulnerability. She was the embodiment of everything the Duke professed to hate: commerce, strategy, and the power of cold, hard cash. Blackwood Manor was a 3-hour carriage ride from London. The journey was a study in encroaching decay. The closer she got to the ducal seat, the more the land seemed to sigh with neglect. Fences were down, fields lay fallow, and the cottages of the tenant farmers looked gaunt and hungry. The great house itself appeared on the horizon like a stone behemoth sinking into the earth. It was magnificent in its scale but heartbreaking in its disrepair. Entire wings were shuttered, windows dark and blind. The gardens were a riot of weeds, statues green with moss and neglect. The stench of trade was absent here, in its place was the smell of damp rot and forgotten glory. The butler who answered the door was ancient, his livery frayed at the cuffs. He looked at her with undisguised astonishment when she announced her name and her intention to see the Duke. She was led not into a grand receiving room, but into a small, cold library where a meager fire sputtered in the hearth. The room smelled of soot and old leather. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes that looked as if they had not been touched in a century. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of winter light. She waited. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound, each tick a small hammer blow against the oppressive silence. It was a house holding its breath. When the Duke finally entered, he looked as weary as his home. He was not wearing the severe black of the ballroom but a worn wool coat and scuffed riding boots. There was a smudge of dirt on his jaw. He looked less like a duke and more like a beleaguered farmer who had lost a battle with his own land. His pale gray eyes widened slightly in surprise, then narrowed into familiar slits of irritation. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble of displeasure. "This is an unexpected, and I must say, unwelcome intrusion." "Your Grace," Elara replied, her own voice cool and steady. She did not curtsy. They were not in a ballroom now. "I have a business proposition for you. I believe it will be worth your time." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Business? I am not a shopkeeper. Whatever you are selling, I am not interested." "You are mistaken," Elara said, taking a step closer to the heavy oak desk that dominated the room. "You are a shopkeeper. And your shop is failing. You are selling your name, your title, your legacy. And I am here to buy it." She placed the folded document on the desk between them. The crisp white paper was a stark slash against the dark, scarred wood. He stared at the document, then back at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. A dull red flush crept up his neck. "How dare you?" The words were a low growl, vibrating with a rage so profound it seemed to shake the very air in the room. He was a predator, cornered and wounded, and for a moment, Elara felt a primal flicker of fear. But she held her ground. Her fear was a distant thing, overshadowed by the cold certainty of her position. "I dare because I have the truth on my side, Your Grace." "And the numbers," she gestured to the document. "That is a marriage contract. My dowry is sufficient to clear every debt listed against the Blackwood estate, restore your lands, and modernize your mines. In return, I will become the Duchess of Blackwood. It is a simple transaction." He stalked around the desk, his height and sheer physical presence meant to intimidate. He loomed over her, a storm cloud of aristocratic fury. "You think you can walk into my home and purchase me like a piece of livestock? You, a grubby merchant's daughter, reeking of the counting house?" "Yes," she said simply, lifting her chin to meet his furious gaze. "That is precisely what I think. Because you have no other choice. Your creditors will wait no longer. Your name is the only asset you have left, and its value depreciates with every passing day. Soon, you will be bankrupt. Blackwood Manor will be carved up and sold off. Your legacy will become a footnote in an auction catalogue. I am not offering you an insult, Your Grace. I am offering you a lifeline." He was silent, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the portrait of a stern-faced ancestor above the mantelpiece. He was trapped. Trapped by his pride, his name, and the failures of those who had come before him. He let out a long, ragged breath, the sound of a fortress finally surrendering. He sank into the worn leather chair behind his desk, the anger in his eyes replaced by a bleak, hollow emptiness. He looked utterly defeated. "It appears," he said, his voice rough with resignation, "that the stench of trade has followed me home." He reached for the document, his hand, rough and calloused from work she was only now beginning to comprehend, shaking almost imperceptibly. He opened it. The bargain was struck. The forced proximity had begun. They were no longer just a duke and a merchant's daughter. They were a line item on a balance sheet, bound together by ink and desperation. The wedding was a small, frigid affair held in the duke's London residence, a house only marginally less gloomy than his country seat. There were no flowers, no music, no guests to speak of save for Elara's stunned father and a grim-faced Mr. Davies. Alistair stood beside her at the altar like a man at his own execution, his responses clipped and barely audible. He did not look at her. When he placed the thin gold band on her finger, his skin was shockingly cold, a brief, dead touch that promised a future of icy formality. That night, he escorted her to the door of her new bedchamber, gave a stiff, formal bow, and retreated to his own rooms on the opposite side of the manor. The heavy oak door closing between them was the most honest communication they had yet shared. Their new life at Blackwood Manor began as it had ended in London, in silence. They were two ghosts haunting the same decaying mausoleum. They took their meals at opposite ends of a cavernously long dining table, the clink of silverware the only sound. He would spend his days out on the estate, wrestling with the physical decay of his lands, and his evenings sequestered in the library. She did not see him, but she smelled the evidence of his presence, the lingering scent of damp wool and wet earth in the halls, the faint aroma of stale tobacco smoke seeping from under the library door. Elara, now the Duchess of Blackwood, did not waste her time on melancholy. She had not purchased a husband, she had purchased a project. On her second day, she requested the estate ledgers. The ancient butler, Hobbs, looked at her as if she had asked for a live dragon. After a brief, clipped order from the Duke, a series of enormous, dust-covered books were delivered to a small, sunless morning room she had claimed as her office. They were a catastrophe. For 200 years, the Blackwood finances had been managed with a blend of aristocratic arrogance and willful ignorance. The bookkeeping was a chaotic scrawl of half-remembered debts and unrecorded expenditures. Rents from tenant farmers had gone uncollected for years. Bills from local merchants were decades old. It was not a ledger book, it was a chronicle of ruin. For the first week, Elara did nothing but work. She rose before the sun, her only companions a pot of strong tea and endless columns of numbers. She built a new set of ledgers from scratch, cross-referencing the chaotic old books with the pile of demands from creditors her solicitor had provided. She worked with a focused, relentless energy that left no room for emotion. This was her battleground, and numbers were her weapons. She was methodically dismantling the ruin he had inherited and building something new and solid in its place. She sent for her father's most trusted accountant, a quiet, efficient man named Mr. Gable. Together, they began to impose order on the chaos. They dispatched notices to tenants, offering a structured plan to pay their arrears. They negotiated with creditors, paying off the most pressing debts first with the initial transfer of her dowry. They audited every aspect of the estate, from the cost of beeswax candles to the wages of the skeleton staff. She was a general marshalling an army against an entrenched enemy. The enemy was waste. It was neglect. It was the proud, foolish belief that a noble name was enough to sustain a household. One evening, late in the second week, she was still hunched over her desk, the room lit by a single oil lamp. The fire had died down to embers, and a damp chill had seeped into the room. She was tracing a discrepancy in the accounts for the estate's timber sales, a sum that seemed to have vanished entirely 5 years prior. The wood had been sold, but the money had never appeared in any ledger. The door creaked open. She did not look up, assuming it was a servant with more tea. "You will ruin your eyes in this light." The voice, his voice, startled her. She looked up to see Alistair standing in the doorway. He was holding a candelabra, the 3 flames casting long, dancing shadows behind him. He was still in his outdoor clothes, his boots muddy, his hair damp from a recent rain. "I have work to do, Your Grace," she said, her tone clipped. She turned back to the ledger, a clear dismissal. He did not leave. Instead, he walked into the room and placed the candelabra on her desk, the sudden increase in light making her blink. He stood beside her, looking down at the open ledger. His proximity was unnerving. She could smell the rain on his coat, the clean scent of the outdoors. It was a stark contrast to the musty air of the room. He pointed a long, calloused finger at the page. "The Westwoods timber," he said, his voice quiet. "My father sold it to pay a gambling debt. The money never touched the estate's accounts." Elara looked from the ledger to his face. His expression was unreadable in the flickering light, but his voice was devoid of its usual biting sarcasm. It was flat. A simple statement of a shameful fact. "I see," she said, making a note in the margin. "Sold to cover personal debt. No income." She drew a firm line through the entry, closing that particular avenue of inquiry. He did not move away. He continued to stare at the pages, at the neat columns of her handwriting, the sharp, clear figures that were so different from the sprawling, chaotic script of his ancestors. He watched as she cross-referenced another figure, her pen scratching softly in the quiet room. "You understand these things," he stated. It was not a question. "I was raised in a counting house, not a drawing room," she replied without looking up. "As you so keenly observed." She expected a sharp retort, a renewal of his contempt. Instead, there was only silence. She finally risked a glance at him. He was watching her, his pale eyes narrowed not in anger, but in a kind of focused, analytical curiosity. It was the look a man gives when he encounters a strange new species, something he does not understand but is compelled to study. He was observing her competence, and it was clearly unsettling him. His initial prejudice, the bedrock of his worldview, was beginning to show cracks. "My father believed numbers were vulgar," he said, his voice soft, almost introspective. He said they were for men who had to work for a living. Your father, Elara said, dipping her pen in the inkwell with a steady hand, was a fool. And now we are paying for his foolishness. It was a brutal, unforgivable thing to say to a man about his late father. She braced herself for the explosion. It did not come. A long, tense moment passed. The clock in the hall chimed 10. Yes, Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. We are. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the candelabra on her desk. Elara stared after him, her pen frozen above the page. The air where he had stood still seemed to hold his scent, a phantom presence. It was the first time they had spoken without hostility. It was the first time he had acknowledged the "we" of their situation. A crack had appeared in the fortress wall, small and barely perceptible, but a crack nonetheless. The thaw, as cold and slow as the melting of a glacier, had begun. A few nights later, a fragile truce formed in the library. Elara, having exhausted every possible line of inquiry in the ledgers for the day, had sought a book to distract her mind. She found Alistair there, slumped in his worn leather chair by the fire, an empty brandy glass on the table beside him. He was not reading, just staring into the flames, the weight of the world etched onto his face. He looked up as she entered, but said nothing. She moved to a distant bookshelf, the silence stretching between them, no longer entirely hostile, but awkward and uncertain. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, the worn velvet and cracked leather, a tactile history of his family. She chose a book of poetry, something she imagined he would find frivolous. As she turned to leave, he spoke. The east wing roof has collapsed in the north corner. She stopped. Is anyone hurt? No. That wing has been empty for 50 years, he swirled the dregs of the brandy in his glass. It's just another piece falling off. Instead of leaving, Elara walked over to the fireplace and sat in the chair opposite his. It was a bold move, a crossing of an unspoken boundary. He watched her, his expression wary. We can't afford to fix it, he said, preempting the question she was about to ask. Not properly. We will patch it for now, she said, her tone practical. We will use slate from the abandoned quarry on the south ridge. It will cost us only the labor. Once the tenant farms are profitable again, we will fund a full repair. He stared at her. She had just laid out a multi-stage logistical plan in the time it had taken him to wallow in his despair. He had been looking at the problem as a single, insurmountable mountain. She had seen it as a series of small, manageable hills. He made a dry, almost humorous sound, a rasp of disbelief. You have an answer for everything, don't you, Duchess? I have a plan for everything, Your Grace, she corrected gently. There is a difference. He fell silent, studying her face in the firelight. For the first time, he was not looking at the merchant's daughter. He was looking at his ally. He refilled his glass and, after a moment's hesitation, poured a small amount into a second glass and pushed it across the table toward her. She accepted it. They drank in silence as the fire crackled, the shared drink a silent acknowledgement of their uneasy truce. The uneasy truce solidified into a fragile alliance in the face of the first autumn storm. It blew in from the north with a savage fury, a howling gale that rattled the windowpanes and tore at the crumbling manor as if trying to pull it down stone by stone. Elara was in her office, trying to reconcile the conflicting accounts of the estate's coal rights, when she heard the crash. It was a sound like a giant's fist punching through the roof, followed by the splintering of ancient timber. She was on her feet instantly. Alistair appeared in the doorway a second later, his face grim. The library, he said, and they ran. A massive oak tree, a sentinel that had stood for centuries, had finally been defeated by the wind. A huge branch, thick as a man's torso, had smashed through one of the tall arched windows, showering the room in glass and rain. Books were scattered, soaked and ruined. The wind howled through the breach, sending papers flying and threatening to extinguish the lamps. For a moment, they both stood there, stunned by the sheer violence of the destruction. The portrait of Alistair's stern-faced ancestor was askew on the wall, a long crack running across his painted face. It felt like a portent. Then, Alistair moved. The books, he yelled over the wind. We have to save the books. But he did not move toward the shelves. He moved toward the desk. His desk. On it, scattered and exposed to the driving rain, were not estate papers, but stacks of letters, tied in ribbon, and a small, leather-bound journal. His personal effects. His history. Elara did not hesitate. While he scrambled to gather the precious letters, she ran to the shelves. She began pulling books from the lower shelves, the ones most exposed to the water pooling on the floor, her arms quickly filling with the heavy, sodden volumes. They were irreplaceable, hand-scribed manuscripts from the 15th century, first editions of Shakespeare. They were the soul of his family's history, more valuable than any parcel of land. Alistair, having secured his papers, turned to help her. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, speaking only in short, clipped commands. The folio. Watch the glass. They were no longer Duke and Duchess, no longer aristocrat and merchant. They were two people fighting a common enemy, the storm. The rigid formality that had defined their existence was stripped away by the urgency of the moment, leaving something raw and real in its place. They piled the rescued books on the far side of the room, a mountain of damp, fragile history. Rain plastered Elara's hair to her face and soaked through her practical wool dress. Her hands were numb with cold, bleeding from a dozen small cuts from broken glass and sharp paper edges. She was reaching for a particularly large tome when a gust of wind slammed a loose section of the window frame inward. It swung wildly, catching on the shelf above her and sending a cascade of heavy books tumbling down. She cried out, more in surprise than fear, and threw her arms up to shield her head. But before they could fall, Alistair was there. He moved with a speed that shocked her, throwing himself in front of her, his body taking the brunt of the falling volumes. The books thudded against his back and shoulders. He grunted in pain but did not move, his arms instinctively coming around her, shielding her in a protective cage. For a long moment, they stood frozen like that, the wind howling around them. Elara was pressed against his chest, her face buried in the rough, damp wool of his coat. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek, a surprising, vital rhythm in the midst of the chaos. His arms were locked around her, his hands splayed across her back. It was not a romantic embrace. It was a purely functional, protective act. An instinct. And yet, it was the most profound physical contact they had ever shared. The shock of it, the unexpected safety of it, sent a tremor through her. He held her for a second longer than was strictly necessary, then slowly, reluctantly, he let her go. He stepped back, his face pale, a dark bruise already forming on his temple where one of the books had struck him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes," she whispered, her own voice unsteady. She looked at his hands. They were scraped and raw. She reached out, without thinking, and took one of his hands in hers. Her fingers traced the calluses on his palm, the rough, battered skin of a man who worked with his hands, a man who fought for his home. It was a stark contrast to the soft, useless hands of a man like Caspian Finch. "You're bleeding," she said softly. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. The guarded mask was gone. In his pale eyes, she saw not anger or irritation, but a dawning, bewildered tenderness. He saw her, soaked and disheveled, her face smudged with dirt, and he did not see the merchant's daughter. He saw the woman who had fought beside him to save his history. Later that night, after the staff had managed to board up the broken window and the storm had begun to recede, they found themselves back in the library. The room was a wreck, but the fire had been rekindled, casting a warm, golden light over the chaos. They were both wrapped in heavy blankets, sipping hot, sweet tea that Hobbs had insisted upon. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty or awkward, but filled with the unspoken events of the night. "Thank you," Alistair said, breaking the quiet. He was staring into the fire, his profile stark and bruised. "For the books. And for not leaving me to face this alone." It was a confession. A revelation of the profound loneliness that had been his constant companion. He had been facing it alone for years. The weight of his legacy, the shame of his father's failures, the slow, inexorable decay of everything he was supposed to protect. "I bought into this firm, Your Grace," Elara said, her voice gentle. "I have no intention of letting it fail." She used the language of commerce, her native tongue, but the meaning was purely personal. "I am here. I am not leaving." He turned to look at her then, a real smile touching his lips for the first time. It was a small, weary thing, but it transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. The finances are more complicated than I ever imagined, he admitted, gesturing vaguely at the mess around them. The debts, my father was not a prudent man. He saw the estate not as a responsibility, but as a vault to be emptied. I have been trying to hold back the tide, but I felt like I was trying to dam a river with my bare hands. It was the first time he had truly revealed the immense pressure he was under. The confession was an act of trust, a laying down of his proud, aristocratic armor. He was showing her the men beneath the title, the burdened, exhausted men who was just trying to keep his head above water. And in that moment, Ilara's strategic, pragmatic plan underwent a subtle but profound shift. Her motivation had been survival, revenge, the acquisition of security. Now, a new, unexpected feeling began to take root, a fierce, protective desire to see this man, her husband, succeed. She saw the path forward not just for the estate, but for him. The tide is not as strong as you think, she said, her voice gaining its familiar, confident edge. The mines are the key. Your father leased the rights for a pittance. The contract is nearly expired. If we modernize the equipment and hire a competent manager, we can make them profitable within 2 years. Truly profitable. It will be enough to clear the remaining debts and fund the full restoration of the manor. She was offering him not sympathy, but a strategy. She was giving him a practical, achievable solution. She was using her greatest strength, her mind for business, not as a weapon against him, but as a tool for their shared salvation. He listened, his expression intent. He was seeing her not just as a competent manager, but as a brilliant strategist. An equal. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. They were no longer adversaries. They were allies. As she spoke, she noticed a smudge of soot on his cheek, just below the bruise on his temple. Without thinking, she leaned forward and gently wiped it away with her thumb. It was a small, intimate gesture. A functional touch, like the fastening of a necklace or the straightening of a collar, yet it was charged with a new, unspoken emotion. He froze at her touch, his breath catching. Her thumb lingered on his skin for a heartbeat, the rough texture of his stubble against her soft skin. The air crackled between them. The warmth of the fire, the scent of rain and old books, the quiet intimacy of the ruined room, it all coalesced into a single, perfect moment of unintentional intimacy. She pulled her hand back, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. He continued to stare at her, his pale eyes full of a wonder and a warmth that stole her breath. The fortress had not just been breached, its gates were slowly swinging open. The invitation arrived 2 months later, a heavy cream card embossed with the crest of the Marquis of Danbury. It was for the annual Winter Gala, the pinnacle of the London season. For most, it was a night of celebration. For Ilara and Alastair, it was a summons to the arena. Their marriage, conducted in haste and secrecy, had been the subject of endless, vicious gossip. They had remained cloistered at Blackwood, but now it was time to face the lions. "We don't have to go," Alastair said, standing by the window of her office. He had taken to visiting her there in the evenings, ostensibly to review her progress with the ledgers, but in truth, it had become their place. The one room in the house that felt like it belonged to both of them. "Yes, we do," Ilara replied, not looking up from the new contract she was drafting for the mine manager. "We have paid your most pressing debts. We have a plan. Now we must project strength. To be absent is to admit weakness. It will invite speculation, and our creditors are still watching." He knew she was right. Their alliance, forged in the quiet decay of Blackwood, now had to be tested in the glittering crucible of London society. It was a strategic necessity. The night of the gala was cold and clear. The Marchioness's ballroom was even more opulent than Ilara remembered, a dizzying spectacle of crystal, gold, and hothouse flowers. The moment they were announced, His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood, a wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. It was like the hush that falls over a theater when the villains walk on stage. Ilara felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, but this time, it was different. She was not alone. Alastair's hand rested firmly in the small of her back, a warm, solid presence. He stood taller, his shoulders squared, the severe black of his evening clothes making him seem more formidable than ever. The haunted, weary look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cool, watchful calm. He was no longer the quiet duke, hiding in the shadows. He was a king returning to his court, and she was his queen. They moved through the room with a deliberate, unhurried grace. Alistair nodded curtly to acquaintances, his expression unreadable, his grip on her never wavering. They were a united front, a fortress of two. The whispers followed them, a constant, buzzing irritation. The attack, when it came, was not subtle. It was led, as Elara had suspected it would be, by Lady Beatrice Croft and her sycophantic echo, Mr. Stirling. They cornered them near the refreshment table, their smiles sharp as daggers. Caspian Finch hovered behind them, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Your Grace," Beatrice purred, sinking into a curtsy before Alistair. She completely ignored Elara. "How wonderful to see you looking so recovered. We had all heard the most dreadful rumors about the state of Blackwood." "Rumors are the currency of the idle, Lady Beatrice," Alistair replied, his voice dangerously smooth. "I deal in more tangible assets." His eyes flickered to Elara for a fraction of a second, a silent message passing between them. Mr. Stirling, eager to curry favor, stepped forward. He looked directly at Elara, his lips twisted in a sneer. "Indeed. And it seems you have made a most profitable acquisition. One must wonder at the price. Is it true, Duchess, that your father simply bought you a title when no gentleman would have you for your charms alone?" The insult was breathtaking in its cruelty. It was a direct, public vivisection of her worth, reducing her marriage to a vulgar transaction and her person to an unsaleable commodity. The surrounding crowd fell silent, their eyes wide with morbid anticipation. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The public humiliation of the upstart Duchess. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. All her carefully constructed composure threatened to shatter. She had expected whispers, but not this. Not a frontal assault. But before she could even form a response, Alistair moved. He took a single step forward, subtly shielding Elara with his body. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The lethal calm that settled over him was more terrifying than any shout. He fixed his pale, icy gaze on Mr. Stirling. "Stirling," he said, the name dropping into the silence like a block of ice. "I have always known you to be a man of little consequence, but I had not realized you were also a man of no breeding whatsoever." Stirling's face went white. "Let me be exceptionally clear," Alistair continued, his voice low and resonant, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You are addressing the Duchess of Blackwood." "My wife," he said the words "my wife" with a fierce, possessive weight that left no room for interpretation. This was not a business partner. This was his. "You speak of her charms," he went on, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the crowd. "You are unqualified to do so. You, and everyone in this room, see only a dowry. You are blind to true worth. You see a ledger book, I see a brilliant strategist who has single-handedly salvaged a legacy that men like you could not comprehend, let alone protect." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Elara's. The warmth and profound admiration in his gaze were a physical blow. It was a public declaration, more intimate and binding than any wedding vow. "My wife's intelligence is a weapon this room cannot fathom. Her resilience is an armor you could never pierce. And her character," he paused, his voice dropping even lower, drawing everyone in, "her character is the single greatest asset the House of Blackwood has acquired in 200 years. She is not the Duchess by purchase. She is the Duchess by merit. She is, in every way that matters, my better half." He then turned his gaze back to the petrified Mr. Stirling. "You will apologize to the Duchess. Now." Stirling, trembling, could only stammer. Your Grace. I meant no offense." "That was not an apology," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a glacial whisper. "Try again." Mr. Stirling turned to Elara, his face a mask of humiliation. Your Grace," he choked out. I apologize." "The Duchess does not accept your apology," Alistair said coolly. "And I do not accept your presence. You will leave. And you will find that very few doors in London will be open to you from now on." It was a sentence of social death, delivered with quiet, absolute authority. Mr. Stirling practically fled, his face ashen. Alistair then turned his attention to Lady Beatrice, whose perfect porcelain face was now a mask of shock and fury. "As for you, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. My wife has more grace in her little finger than you possess in your entire, vapid person. I suggest you remember that. He offered his arm to Elara. Duchess. Shall we dance? It was the first time he had ever asked her. It was the first time in 8 seasons that the quiet Duke had offered to dance with anyone. Elara, her heart hammering in her chest, a dizzying mix of shock, triumph, and a soaring, unfamiliar joy, placed her hand on his arm. He led her to the center of the ballroom. The orchestra, as if on cue, struck up a waltz. The sea of onlookers parted before them. As he took her in his arms, the whispers were gone. They had been replaced by a stunned, grudging silence. The silence of respect. He held her firmly, expertly guiding her through the steps. They moved as one, a single, undeniable unit of power and grace. He had not just defended her. He had eviscerated her attackers. He had publicly declared his profound respect and admiration for her. He had used his power, the very power of the aristocracy she had once despised, to validate her completely. The battle was won. Her vindication was absolute. As they danced, locked in each other's gaze, Elara knew that their marriage of convenience was well and truly over. Something real, something powerful, something that felt terrifyingly like love, had taken its place. The carriage ride back to their London house was silent. The air was thick not with tension, but with the unspent energy of the evening's confrontation. Elara sat across from Alistair, her hands clasped in her lap, her mind replaying his words over and over again. My wife. Her character is the single greatest asset. My better half. Each phrase was a brand, marking her not as his property, but as his partner. His equal. When they arrived, he dismissed the servants and escorted her up the grand staircase himself, a lamp held high in his hand. The light cast their long shadows against the wall, 2 figures intertwined. They walked to her bedchamber, the same room where he had left her so formally on their wedding night. The memory of that cold, silent departure felt like a lifetime ago. He stopped at her door and turned to face her. The emotional exhaustion of the night was visible on both their faces, but beneath it was a current of profound, unspoken connection. The public roles were done for the night. The Duke and Duchess were gone. Only Alistair and Elara remained. You were magnificent, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I only spoke the truth, he replied, his gaze intense. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. He hurt you. I saw it in your eyes. I never want to see that look in your eyes again. Her gown, a deep emerald velvet chosen to project wealth and power, suddenly felt heavy and constricting. A piece of her public armor. On her neck rested a heavy diamond necklace, a key part of her ducal regalia, a symbol of the fortune she had brought to their union. It felt cold against her skin. Alistair's eyes dropped to the necklace. That looks heavy, he murmured. His hands moved from her face to the back of her neck. His fingers, warm and surprisingly gentle, fumbled with the clasp. It was a slow, deliberate act. The removal of a symbol. He was unfastening the glittering emblem of their transaction, peeling away the last layer of their public roles to get to the private truth beneath. The necklace came free. He did not drop it, but held its cold weight in his palm for a moment before setting it carefully on a nearby table. His hands returned to her neck, his thumbs stroking the bare skin where the diamonds had been. The touch was electric, a stark contrast between his calloused skin and her own. Elara, he said, her name a soft breath. It was the first time he had used it without a trace of formality. Why, she asked, her voice barely audible. Why did you agree to the marriage? I know it was not just the money. You could have found a more suitable bride, an aristocrat with a smaller dowry. Why me? He let out a long, slow breath, his eyes filled with a self-deprecating regret. Because I was a fool, he confessed. And a coward, he looked away for a moment, gathering his thoughts. That day, in the ballroom, when I insulted you. It was not because I despised you. It was because I was terrified of you. She stared at him, bewildered. Terrified? Of me? Yes, he said, his gaze meeting hers again, raw and honest. You stood there, taking the scorn of those mindless peacocks, and you did not crumble. You had a strength I had never seen in a woman of our class. And when you came to my alcove, that curtsy, he shook his head, a small, wry smile on his lips. It was the most defiant act I had ever witnessed. In that moment, you held all the power. And then, when you came to Blackwood with your contract, you saw right through me. You saw the rot, the failure. You saw the truth I was trying so desperately to hide. It was humiliating. He paused, his thumb stroking her skin. I agreed to the marriage out of desperation, yes. But also out of a deep, grudging respect. And curiosity. I had to know the woman who could face down a duke in his own crumbling fortress and make him surrender. His voice dropped to a husky whisper. I was a proud, prejudiced man, Elara. Blinded by a world of empty titles and meaningless traditions. You forced me to see. You showed me what real worth is. It is not in a name. It is in here. He gently touched his fingers to her temple. And in here he laid his palm flat against her heart. Tears welled in Elara's eyes. Tears not of sorrow or humiliation, but of a profound, overwhelming release. Everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, it was all seen. It was all valued. Alistair, she breathed, her own voice thick with unshed tears. I came to you for revenge. For security. I saw you as a means to an end. A title to be purchased. I know, he said softly. We were two combatants in a war of convenience. But somewhere in the ruins of Blackwood, we found something else. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. She leaned into him, meeting him halfway. His lips met hers, and it was nothing like the cold, dead touch on their wedding day. This kiss was not transactional or accidental. It was a conscious, deliberate expression of everything they had become. It was not a fiery, desperate kiss of passion, but something deeper, more grounded. It was heavy with unspoken confessions, with shared burdens, with the quiet strength of their alliance. It was a kiss that tasted of respect, of admiration, of a hard-won, unexpected love. It was real. It was a foundation, built not on sand, but on the solid rock of mutual understanding. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I love you, Elara, he whispered, the confession sounding as if it had been torn from the very depths of his soul. Not for your dowry, or your mind, though I admire it more than I can say. I love you for the steel in your spine and the grace in your heart. And I love you, Alistair, she replied, her tears finally falling, hot and cleansing. Not for your title, but for the men who fought to save his home, and who fought to defend his wife. He swept her into his arms then, a real embrace this time, full of warmth and promise. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her across the threshold of her bedchamber. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them, not as a barrier, but as a sanctuary. The private resolution was complete. The merger was finalized. The Duke and the merchant's daughter were, at last, simply husband and wife. A year later, the scent of Blackwood Manor had changed. The damp chill and the smell of rot had been banished, replaced by the warm, inviting aromas of lemon wax, burning apple wood, and baking bread. The house was no longer holding its breath, it was breathing again, alive and filled with light. Winter had given way to a glorious, sun-drenched summer, and the change in season mirrored the transformation within the manor's walls. Elara stood on the newly repaired stone terrace, a ledger book resting on the balustrade. But she was not looking at the numbers. She was looking out over the gardens, which were no longer a tangled mess of weeds but a tapestry of vibrant, orderly color. In the distance, the fields were green and heavy with impending harvest. The sound of hammers echoed from the east wing, where a team of skilled masons was conducting the final phase of its full restoration. Blackwood was thriving. She heard footsteps behind her and smiled without turning. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist, and a familiar, clean scent of bergamot and sunshine filled her senses. Alistair rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand spreading protectively over her slightly rounded belly. Reviewing our empire, Duchess, he murmured into her hair. Assessing our assets, Your Grace, she corrected, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. The mine's production is up 17% this quarter. Mr. Gable has done wonders. Gable is a fine accountant, Alistair agreed. But he had a brilliant strategist guiding his hand. He turned her in his arms to face him, his pale gray eyes, once so cold, now filled with a deep and abiding warmth. He looked at her, then at the ledger she still held. Have you balanced the books for the day? Almost, she said. There is still one entry I am unsure of. Oh, he asked, a playful glint in his eye. What is it? An unrecorded asset, she said, her expression serious. One of a singular, immeasurable value. I am not sure how to categorize it. He feigned a thoughtful frown. An unrecorded asset. That is a serious oversight. Describe it to me. Well, she began, tapping a finger to her lips. He is tall, ridiculously proud, and initially possessed a temperament somewhere between a thunderstorm and a block of ice. However, he has proven to be surprisingly resilient, unexpectedly tender, and works very hard. Also, she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, he is a duke. Alistair threw back his head and laughed, a rich, genuine sound that echoed across the terrace. It was a sound she had come to cherish, a sound that had been absent from this house for far too long. And what is the liability associated with this asset? He asked, pulling her closer. A complete and total monopoly on my heart, she confessed, her voice soft. It seems to be a permanent arrangement. The best kind, he said, his smile fading into something more tender. The only kind. He did not kiss her. Instead, he simply held her, his hand resting gently on the swell of her stomach where their child, the future of Blackwood, was growing. They stood together in the warm afternoon sun, a silent, perfect partnership. They were no longer a transaction, no longer a treaty forged from desperation. They were a team, a family. The quiet duke and the pragmatic merchant's daughter had built something far more valuable than a restored fortune or a secured title. They had built a home. He looked out at the restored lands, at the tangible proof of their joint efforts. The weight of his legacy was no longer a crushing burden, but a shared responsibility, a joy. He had started as the proud, prejudiced aristocrat, and she the underestimated strategist. Now, they were simply Alistair and Elara, their love built not on the fleeting passion of a ballroom romance, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of mutual respect, shared struggle, and a ledger book that was, at long last, perfectly balanced. He leaned down and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to her temple, a quiet affirmation of a love that was both a safe harbor and a grand adventure. The fortress had become a home. The ruin had become a legacy. And it was theirs.